In this video, I'm going to be teaching you guys about data store service, and I'm going to explain it to you as if you were 5 years old to make the concept very easy. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's just go ahead and enter a script into script service, and let's go ahead and get data store service. So we're just going to say local data store service is equal to game : get service data store service. So now what we need to do is we need to make something called a data store. So we'll say local data store is equal to data store service : get data store. And then all we need to go ahead and pass through is the name for our data store. So this is basically where all of our data is going to actually live. This part isn't too important, so we'll just name it data store. You can name this basically whatever you want. But for example, this could be like player data, and then we can go and copy it and name this player data. It could be named basically anything you want. This is just where we're going to keep our data stored. So now let's go ahead and get the player service. That way we're able to actually track when a player joins the game. So we'll say local players is equal to game : get service players. And now we can do the classic player added function. So we'll say players.player added : connect to a function that gives us the player here. Now guys, the main thing that you want to keep in mind, like when it comes to data, you want to know what you're actually doing. And what you're actually doing is you're saving values. Like for example, you're saving a number, or you could be saving a string. So for example, let's say you want to save the player's health. So you can like have a data piece called health, set it equal to a number. So what you're doing is you're essentially saving the number, or like you could also be saving a string. For example, if you want to save the player's name, if it was equal to a string like Ebo, for example, this is what you're actually saving. That's all you're saving. You're just saving a number, a string. You can also save, for example, booleans. So you're able to save like, for example, like true or false. So like if you wanted to save the player settings, like if they had music turned to off, you could save it as false. And then, for example, you could also save tables. So you could basically save a table that has any of these things inside of it. So for example, if you had a bunch of numbers in here, you could save that. And these are basically the only things that you're actually allowed to save. So for example, you're not able to directly save like vector 3s. Instead, you would have to make a table, and you would have to do something like x is equal to 10, and then y is equal to 15, and then z is equal to 20. So I hope that makes sense. These are basically the main types that you're going to be saving: number, string, boolean. So now that you know like what you're actually able to save, let me go ahead and tell you guys how to save it. So before we get into that, I just made some quick leader stats here, guys. And then I went ahead and made a user input script. Real quick, guys, if you guys have been wanting to learn how to script on Roblox, check out the first link in the description. So that way, basically, whenever we click, we add 1 to our coins value inside of our leader stats. So that's basically all I did so far. So now let's say, for example, I wanted to actually be able to save this, then we would actually need access to the data store. So as you can see here, it says you must publish this place to the web. So basically, whenever we're using data store, we need to make sure our game is published. So I'm just going to rename this to DataStoreService Video, and then I'm just going to go ahead and save it. And then once I have done that, I want to also go ahead and turn on API services. So to do that, just click on File on the top left. Go to Experience Settings, scroll down to Security, and Enable Studio Access to API Services. So basically, this just enable Studio to have access to things like data stores. So we need this if we want to work with data stores. So now if I play the game and let's say I wanted to get 5 coins and then I leave, obviously my data is not going to save and I only have 0 coins when I join back. But let's say, for example, I wanted to save it. So whenever I left the game, I would basically let the game know how many coins I had when I left. So to do this, we would use a method called :setAsync. And this is basically how we tell the game what data we want to save. So let's go ahead and make a player removing function, because that's when we actually want to save data. That's the specific moment that we like tell the game, hey, this is all the data that we want to save. Go ahead and save it. So let's do players.player removing : connect to a function would be player. So now that we've made this event, what we want to do is, first of all, we want to go ahead and make a key, and we want to make each key specific for each individual player, because we need a way to differentiate. Like for example, inside of our player data, like how are we going to know whose data is this player's? Or if we had like a different player, so like player 2, how would we know which player is like this player's? And the way we do that is we basically set a key for each player and we save it to that key. So let's go ahead and say local key is equal to, and this is usually how you format it. So for example, I'll say player, and then I'll put underscore, and then I'll concatenate it with the player. Now the player.user ID is very important because this never changes for each player. So it's always going to be the same, which is why, for example, like you don't use their username, because they could always change their username. And then for example, let's say that in the past you've saved their key as player underscore monkey boy. Let's say that this was this guy's username, and then they changed it. So they changed their username to banana boy. When this guy plays the game and they look for monkey boy, it doesn't pop up for this guy because his username is now banana boy. So basically you want to use their player.userid in the key basically all the time. So now that you have the key, you want to actually have the data that you want to save. So for us, we just simply want this number right here, which is the amount of coins that they have. And well, to do that, that's pretty simple. So we could just say local data is equal to a table, because this is usually how it's formatted. And then we'll just say coins is equal to player.leaderstats.coins.value. So remember guys, this literally just equates to a number, which is however many coins we have when we leave the game. And then like if you wanted to say, for example, their name, it would just be name is equal to player.name. That's a string. And then obviously we could save like so many kinds of data, but for now, let's just stick with this because it's pretty simple. So now that we have basically told the game like what data we want to save, we need to actually go ahead and start saving the data. So guys, this is where it can get a little bit tricky. At least it did for me. What we're going to do is we're going to use something called a protected call function. And a protected call function either returns, so a protected call function returns two values. So let me show you guys that right now. So we'll say local, and then it returns success and then error message. So basically what this means is first of all, it tells us whether or not it was successful in saving our data. And then the error message is just the error message that pops up if an error did occur. So we set this equal to a protected call function, just like this. So basically what a protected call function does is it just runs the provided function. So whatever code we put inside of there, and it catches any error it throws, returning the function's success and its results. So you can think about this as the result and this as whether or not it was successful. So we can go ahead and click enter. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say player data, because remember, this is the data store that we created up here. And then we can do :set async. And what set async does is it basically tells the game, hey, this is the data that I want to save for this player. And well, how do we know what player to save it for? Well, that's where the key comes in. So we're going to pass through that key that we made up there, and then we can do a comma, and then the data that we actually want to save. So we could just simply pass through the data. And guys, that's all we need to do to save data. And if you wanted to, we can make it a little more protected. So like, for example, we could go ahead and wrap this around like 10 times if it's not successful. So for example, I'll give you guys a quick example, and this is not needed, but it's just like an extra security step. So for example, we could say local count is equal to 0. And then we could say for I is equal to 1. And then like comma 10 do. So basically this is going to run 10 times if it's not successful for whatever reason. Or actually, we could probably just destroy this local count because we're using a for loop. And then for example, we could say if not success, then we can go ahead and warn error saving data for player underscore, and then concatenate it with their player.userid. And then after we warn it, we can go ahead and do a task.wait for like 1 second. Or maybe like 0.5 seconds, and then we can go ahead and continue. So what this is going to do is if the first time it wasn't successful, it goes ahead and tries again, and it keeps doing that for 10 more times. And then after 10 times, if it still wasn't successful, then we are just going to go ahead and stop. So we can make this like 0.1, for example. But guys, this really isn't needed. It's just like an extra security kind of protocol. And then up here, we'll say if success, which means it was successful, then we can go ahead and break out of the for loop because we only want to do it once, of course. And then we could also print data saved for player underscore and then concatenate it with their player.userid. So guys, this is literally all we're doing. This is all you need to know. You just need to know what data you want to save. You just need the key, which is going to be the same for every player. Like not the key itself, but the format is going to be the same for every player. And then you just need to go ahead and learn what a protected call function is. And then remember the method called set async, and that's all you need to do. Okay, so now that we have successfully saved our data, we need to know how, like when to join, we can get our data and then set the appropriate values to our data values. So I'll show you guys what I mean. So when we join, we need to get the data for this player. So we actually do it pretty similarly as here, except we don't make the data. We're going to be receiving the data. So we can do the same thing. We obviously need the key. So we'll say local key is equal to player underscore, and then concatenate it with the player.userid. So now that we have the key, we can go ahead and make another protected call function. So we can say local success comma data, because this time the result of whatever is returned is going to be our data. So that's why it's not error, because here we're not really returning anything. We're just kind of saving our data. But if it does return something, that means that it's going to be an error. But here it's going to just simply be returning our data. So we're going to set this equal to a protected call function, of course. And then this just does the same thing. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say return player data :get async. So guys, these are literally the only two methods that you need to know. Just kind of practice this and remember this, and you'll get better with it over time. And then guys, guess what? All we need to do is pass through the key, and we're done. That's literally it. So of course, we could also implement like a for loop to say like, okay, if not successful, then we could keep running this until we have the data. So let's go ahead and make another for loop. So we'll try 10 times. So we'll say for I equals 1, 10 do. And then we're going to go ahead and copy this like that. And then we could simply say if success, then we can go ahead and break out of this. And then we can go ahead and say end. And they'll say if not success, then we can go ahead and warn error loading data for player underscore. And then we can concatenate it with the player.userid. And then for example, we could do a task.wait for like 0.1 seconds. And then we can go ahead and continue on with the for loop. And then inside of here, we're not actually going to do a break end for the success. We're going to say if success then, and then basically we know that it is successful, and then we're going to get our data from here. So we can go ahead and say if data then, and the reason why we're saying this is because it could be successful, but the data also cannot be there if they're a new player. Because if they're a new player, you have to think about it. They never get removed from the game because it's their first time playing. So there's no data that they're actually going to have. So we need to make sure, first of all, that they have data. So if they do have data, then we save their coins and their name. So let's go ahead and get the coins that we saved and set it equal to the coins value. And this is just something that I made up here. So we can go in and say coins.value is equal to data.coins. That's all we need to do to basically set our data that we saved to our coins value. And that's it. And then the other thing we saved was the name. But since, we can't really implement that, so we can just go ahead and set that as that. And then we can go ahead and break out of this for loop. And then we could say else, which means that it's their first time playing. We could just have the default value be 0, for example. And then we could also break. And then inside of this if not success then, we can go ahead and say if I, which is just the iteration the for loop is on, is equal to, let's do 10. And then we could go ahead and say then, and then we could just kick the player from the game. So we'll do player :kick, and then the message is going to be data error. Because if they don't have their data loaded successfully, we don't want them to play and have some problems with their data. It just wouldn't be good. So yeah, we're just going to go ahead and kick them if the iteration is at 10. And that's basically all we need to do, guys. That's literally it. You just need to follow this formula, and if you have more data to save, so for example, if you have an inventory and this was equal to a table with, let's say an item name is equal to test, and let's say you just had a bunch of values in here, you would be able to save it to a table. So let's go ahead and test it out and make sure that it's working first of all. So I'm going to go ahead and get 5 coins, and then I'm going to leave, and then it says data saved for player and then my user ID, and then I'm going to join back. And okay, so it didn't save. So let's see why it didn't save. Okay, guys, so the problem was actually pretty silly, but I'm basically changing the value from a local script. So I'm changing it from the client, but then I'm checking from the server to see what the value is. So it's basically always going to be 0 in the server since I'm changing it from the client. So I'm just going to go ahead and add in a remote event to go ahead and change it to the server. So I'll just rename this to increase coin. So I went ahead and made the remote event and I fired it to the server and I picked it up here. So now everything should be working properly. That was such a silly mistake by me. So let's say I just get some coins here and I go ahead and get it up to like 30, and then I go ahead and leave the game. And then I go ahead and join back. I still have 30 coins. So that's basically how you save your data. So guys, just keep practicing this method here. I know that implementing the for loop makes it actually a little more difficult because it's like a lot more code to write. But just remember, the central idea is you need to use :get async to get your data, and then :set async to set your data to the key. And then of course you need to learn about protected calls. But other than that, guys, that's basically going to be it.